Hey friends, David from Live Forever Die Trying, and today I've got a proper wrap-up video for you. Normally I think I wrap these up like once every 6 months, but I'm gonna try to see if we can get on a monthly habit with these. And this month was actually really good for me. When I made my last video wrapping up the first 5 months of the year, I'd only read 18 books, and this past month and a few weeks, I've actually read 12. So it's been a pretty good average. In fact, it's been like the most books I've read in like a given period. I was averaging about 3 books a week. So judging by my math, if I kept up this pace for the remainder of the year, I'd be able to finish 78 more books. In 10 years, if I read 3 books per week, I'd be able to finish 1,560. And if I lived to 80 years old, reading 3 books a week, I could read 8,736 books. But that's not gonna happen. But it is fun to think about, like if I could theoretically keep up this pace. But if you have like your top 8,000 books, leave them below in the comments. I'll check them out, put them on my TBR. Without further ado, let's jump into what I read this month. As always, I'll give a brief description, tell you if I liked it or not, and then if I would recommend it. So the first book I read this month, which really kicked off the habit strong, was Why Buddhism is True by Robert White. Now, this book, the title is kind of misleading in my opinion, because it kind of comes across as almost like a more religious sounding book. But what it actually does is it goes through the modular theory of mind within psychology as it applies to Buddhism. And it does a really, really good job of laying this out. If you're not familiar, the modular theory of mind is that you have different modules in your brain, different parts of the brain that can solve the same problem in different ways. And the brain kind of works like a democracy. With the brain that thinks, or the part of the brain that has the best solution ends up overpowering the other modules. And that's how thoughts or actions or what have you are created. And this is really interesting in regards to backing up a lot of like the mindfulness Buddhism teachings and how thoughts arise in the brain in the first place, and allows you to step back and realize there's no I, ego, or self, and have a scientific reason with backup, like from the actual literature, of to why Buddhism could be true. So I really, really love that approach. In fact, this kind of like scientific approach to Buddhism and meditation in general made me pick up The Mind Illuminated here. I'll touch more on this book because it's one of 3 books I'm reading that are kind of like how-tos or instructionals, not like a proper read. But I'll talk about those later. But scientific approach to meditation and its benefits, they're sweet. The second book I finished off this month was Ending Aging by Aubrey de Grey. You heard me talk about this in the last video, the 5-book starter pack on longevity, so I won't spend too much on this. Basically, it's talking about the 7 aspects of sins or strategies for engineered negligible senescence. And basically, the 7 things Aubrey de Grey thinks that we need to fix if we want to combat aging. Pretty dense on the scientific aspect, but it's really good for laying out kind of like foundational theories of longevity and if living forever is possible. All right, next up we have one of my favorite books of the month, which is Hacking Darwin by Jamie Metzl. Now this was a really, really cool book if you simultaneously like want to feel in awe of what we can do with genetics as well as in fear of a potential dystopian future. So this book is kind of divided into 3 parts. In the beginning, Jamie takes us through like the recent history of genetics, how we got to where we are, then goes into a lot of what we're working on right now in current technologies, all the way up to CRISPR and genetic editing and engineering, which if you've read The Gene by Siddhartha Mukherjee, it's going to rehash a lot of it, but it's also going to, help you remember it. That's not really why I love this book. The last third of this book is where it really starts popping off. And it's talking in a very, very cautious tone about what could happen if we don't start having conversations about genetic engineering. He's basically making a plea to beg society to think about what could occur. So it goes everything from designer babies to making sperm and eggs from whatever, which is kind of cool. You can take like Yamanaka factors, like you can take the skin cell of two dudes, theoretically, and take the skin from each of them, turn both of them back into a stem cell. Make one of the stem cells a sperm, one an egg, and you can fertilize it to have a biological baby of two gay men. And it talks about really, really cool science about how this could be possible in the near future. But at the same time, that technology that lets two gay men have a biological son, it also talks about accelerated eugenics, which Nick Bostrom, which is a philosopher from somewhere in Europe, I want to say Cambridge, Oxford. I'm going to butcher that, and I'm going to regret saying that. But Nick Bostrom came up with simulation theory, really smart mind. But he talks about accelerated eugenics, which is using that same Yamanaka factors to like mate cells together, and theoretically you'd have to do this like IVF and fertilize it outside of a body. But you could keep doing that every 6 months and artificially select for certain traits like intelligence or what have you. But that's following the same story as what we did with eugenics in like the 1920s through 1940s, and really dangerous territory. So that's what this book really shines at, is these potential dystopian futures or potential breakthroughs in science. It's absolutely fascinating, and I'd highly recommend it. Then we had Bad Blood. This book got a lot of press recently. I think it came out this year or last year, but it's a Secret and Lies in a Silicon Valley startup by John Carreyrou, and it's kind of like a tell-all of the company Theranos, which made these blood testing machines, and it's just like almost like a thriller in how the deception and lies and how this company grew and fell apart under Elizabeth Holmes, the CEO at the time. And I think it really does a good job about showing kind of off the worst aspects of capitalism. It's a fun read. You're not going to learn too much from it. You'll probably reinforce some stereotypes you've had about Silicon Valley, but it was a good read. It was actually one of the first of 2 books I read this month on Silicon Valley. The second book was Uncanny Valley by Anna Weiner? But this one is more of a lighter note. It's basically Anna is working in the literary world, I believe as a literary agent back in New York, but is kind of at a dead end with no route for, I guess, climbing the ladder or progress within her career. So what she ends up doing is taking her soft skills with working with people and moving out to Silicon Valley to work in tech. So over the course of the book, it kind of tells her story, adjusting to like the male chauvinistic life of a tech worker. It touches briefly on surveillance capitalism, racism, and sexism within that world, as well as the general like lifestyle of people that work in Silicon Valley. My only complaint is it kind of touched on each of these and had like a chapter where sexism was talked about, where racism was talked about, where surveillance capitalism felt like they got 2 sentences on it, and then completely brushed off to continue the story of the book, which that kind of, I felt there was more potential there other than just telling her story, where she could have made commentary on this and from the inside when she worked out, or made a lot of like thought-provoking arguments, but that was kind of skipped over. If you're looking for another story about just Silicon Valley lifestyle, it's good to read, but if you're looking for anything deeper than that, I think you should skip it. Then we had one of my big disappointments so far, which was Principles by Ray Dalio. Now, this book is a book you'll see on like every business entrepreneur's like top 5 books if you want to be good at business. And to be honest, I thought it was super shallow. So Ray Dalio has the company Bridgewater, where basically they use kind of like computer models to make investments and decisions with the stock market and rich people's money. And the first part of this book talks about Ray's business and how it formed and the characteristics he needs to operate it so successfully, and a few of the intuitive things he does operating inside the company to kind of maximize the potential of his staff, I guess. And what this book tries to do is lay out the principles that he uses to build his company so that you can improve yours. And to be honest, it felt really kind of boring and shallow. Like, there's a few really interesting and innovative things he did, such as making baseball cards for his employees that show strengths and weaknesses and make sure he assigns the right people to the right jobs. But honestly, a lot of it's like super shallow, duh kind of moment, like be honest, hire good people, kind of like really boring, basic, rudimentary stuff. And maybe if I read it more, like I'll get more value out of it, but honestly, I ended up skipping a few of the last chapters because it was just kind of bleh. Then I finished another Malcolm Gladwell book. This time it was David and Goliath, Underdogs, Misfits, and the Art of Battling Giants. Stereotypical Gladwell. It was really engaging reads, and he was using correlation equals causation to try to give you strategies on overcoming the odds. So it's a fun kind of pop psychology book or sociology book to read. And the stories are interesting, but I wouldn't draw any of the larger conclusions from it. I don't know how backed up they are. What I did think was especially good was kind of like 3 of the last chapters and how they can kind of parallel current events with the protest and Black Lives Matter and everything. So towards the end of the books, the Malcolm Gladwell talks about the civil rights movement in Birmingham, and what I thought was really interesting is how Walker, the guy under Martin Luther King, actually antagonized the police with 14-year-old kids to get the dog bite, to like get that photo in the news to make impacts across the nation. In addition, how they purposely delayed the walks in Birmingham so that people would gather on the side of the streets that weren't part of the protest. Then when the protesters walked by, the newspapers would report that there's way more people at the walks. And I think that was really interesting as far as overcoming the odds in that way. In addition, it talks about British Protestants versus Catholics in Ireland, and California's 3-strike laws regarding just 3 strikes and you're out, you have a felony and a minimum sentence in prison. And I think that with mass incarceration is really important to learn about right now. So for those 3 reasons alone, I would almost recommend this book if you're looking for something kind of fun to read that has parallels to what's happening right now. Speaking of parallels to what's happening right now, we have the New Jim Crow. And the New Jim Crow is all about mass incarceration. It is a really, really solid book. It does a good job of making good statistical based arguments, and then putting commentary on those to kind of draw what the effects are within the population of the United States, and particularly African American men. What I found absolutely jarring from this book is, due to the mass incarceration system we have set up now, and kind of the unfair targeting, she keeps coming back in this book to talk about the use of drugs between different populations. So white people use drugs at the same amount as black people, but black people are incarcerated far more often just due to the way that policing is done. And the numbers are something that I knew mass incarceration was bad, but until I read this book, I didn't know how bad it was till the numbers really started hitting. For example, over 65 million people in the United States have criminal records. That's out of 318 million right now, I believe, which is insane. Okay, I'm gonna embarrass myself, but is that an eighth of the population? In addition, 7.4 million are currently in prison or on parole under government surveillance, which is insane. And almost a third of black male citizens have a felony on their record, which is absolutely mind-blowing. The other really important fact that I thought I pulled away from this book, which kind of goes for the defunding the police argument, is reappropriating the funds and trying to narrow down the intent of the police. If you want to learn kind of like some strategies that you could defund the police with, I think it makes a really compelling argument for nonviolent crimes. For example, there's a statistic in this book that says only 5% of crimes are violent. So let's say out of those nonviolent crimes, 20% were absolutely vital, need police there. They don't need a social worker. They don't need somebody that can handle mental health issues or whatever else. You can still theoretically eliminate 75% of what the police are doing, at least responding to certain things, or maybe there's a better avenue to help out some of these nonviolent crimes. But this book will make you ask a lot of questions, and I think it's a really good read. Up next, kind of talking about like more African American culture and reading on that topic because of recent events, we had Conversation in Black by Ed Gordon. And this is a, simply put, really fun book. So this basically takes a bunch of names that you've heard in the African American community, whether they are rappers or people of the NAACP or basically any influential character, and they have like almost a roundtable discussion. They talk about a lot of really interesting topics, such as, will the black vote control the 2020 election? Do black lives really matter? After Obama's presidency, are black people better off? Stereotypical images of black people in Hollywood, and black girl magic. And basically covers the entire gambit of issues black people are facing and gives you 20 different perspectives on each of those issues. I think it's just a really good book to learn the nuanced responses and the variation of responses within the black community and kind of see what the people that are affected by it are thinking on these issues. Up next, we had When They Call You a Terrorist by Patrisse Khan-Cullors. And if you're not familiar, Patrisse is one of the founding members of Black Lives Matter. And this is her memoir about how she grew up, how her family was terrorized by police, and just a really moving story. Talks about a lot of the kind of bullshit laws that are on the books that are made as an excuse to give police way too much discretion. She talks about her brother was arrested one day in the alley because of gang-related clothing, and her brother was wearing a white t-shirt with two other male teens that were wearing white t-shirts. And other stupid things like that that allow police to basically pick on or find reasons to arrest anybody they want to. So I think it's a really good book for that reason alone, kind of in real life stories about how the laws in the books affect the people that we may not hear about. I'd really recommend this book if you're looking for a background on how Black Lives Matter started in the first place. It's super interesting, and I think it's a really kind of heartfelt story and really honestly kind of sad, especially for what happens to her brother when he's basically tortured in prison and the following lawsuits that occurred after that. I would definitely recommend the book. Up next, we had Fantasyland, How America Went Haywire, a 500-year history by Kurt Anderson. Now, this book is really fun. So it goes through basically since the beginning of our nation, all the crazy shit people have believed in. Whether it is changing religion to fit their needs, calling Native Americans like Satan's soldiers so that they could kill them off, or just all the other crazy shit. Snake oil, you name it. Different doomsday theorists, conspiracy theorists, all the way up to like modern day issues. Now, the problem I had with this book is it almost feels like it was working backwards. And when I say that, what I mean is reading the back cover, there's this quote that I think describes the book really well, which is the single most important explanation and the fullest explanation of how Donald Trump became president of the United States. Nothing less than the most important book I've read this year. And to be honest, I wish it wasn't claiming to be that or based on that. Because it almost feels like certain parts of American history that could be really cool to read about in this book were left out because he was trying to build up a narrative of how we got to Trump. And don't get me wrong, Orange Man is bad, but I feel like he started with Donald Trump and started working backwards, finding events that didn't have any basis to kind of build an attack on what Donald Trump is. And the only reason I have a big problem with that is about a third of the book, I would say, is kind of attacking Christianity specifically. And while I liked hearing about the different things that Protestant religions believe in and different things that might be silly within those, I was raised Methodist myself, it felt very targeted, and I felt like it left out other vectors via other religions or just other content he could comment on. Like, I don't believe there was ever anything talking about mass shootings or why, like, that's an American problem or anything. The idealization of, like, these radicals that are homegrown within our country. Because I felt like everything in this book was kind of funneled into coming to a point at Trump. But nonetheless, if you don't read the last two chapters, which last two chapters were still very good, which talked about like modern society and Trump, but I still think it was a really fun book to read. And finally, probably one of the most important books I've read this month is Permanent Record by Edward Snowden. And Edward Snowden was the gentleman that leaked the NSA's surveillance program back in 2013. And I think this is a really important read just to kind of humanize that entire situation. So instead of saying too much on the book, I'm going to read one of my favorite quotes from the book instead to finish this off. Edward Snowden said, "There is simply no way to ignore privacy, because a citizen's freedoms are interdependent. To surrender your own privacy is to surrender everyone's. You might choose to give it up out of convenience or under the popular pretext that privacy is only required for those who have something to hide. But saying that you don't need or want privacy because you have nothing to hide is like saying that no one should or could have anything to hide, including immigration status, unemployment history, financial history, and health records. You're assuming that no one, including yourself, might object to revealing anyone's information about their religious belief, political affiliations, or sexual activities, as casually as somebody chooses to reveal their movie and music taste and reading preferences. Ultimately, saying that you don't care about privacy because you have nothing to hide or nothing different from saying you don't care about freedom of speech because you don't have anything to say. Or that you don't care about freedom of press because you don't have anything to read. Or that you don't care about freedom of religion because you don't believe in God. Or that you don't care about the freedom to peacefully assemble because you're a lazy, antisocial agoraphobe. Just because this or that freedom might not have meaning to you today doesn't mean that it doesn't or won't have meaning tomorrow to you, your neighbor, or the crowds of principled descendants I was following on my phone who were protesting halfway across the planet, hoping to get a fraction of the freedom that our country is busily dismantling. So yeah, I think privacy is a big deal and something we should all focus on a little bit more. I will be reading more on this particular topic coming up, and hopefully I can put together a video on that in particular. But yeah, that kind of wraps up my reading. Really good month on the books for me this time. If you have any recommendations on what you'd like to see me read or review, drop them below. As always, subscribe if you want more, ring the bell if you want notifications, and let me know your thoughts on the video. Appreciate it, guys. See ya.